Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
All right, good afternoon, Team Krulak community. And on behalf of Marine Corps University, the Marine Corps University Foundation, and the Baruch Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare, welcome back to the Baruchcast, our series designed to connect the worlds of the warfighter and PME with the best in innovative and creative thought. I'm your host, Major Ian Brown, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center. Before we begin, please remember that all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, the United States Marine Corps, or any other agency of the U.S. government. So today's episode is very timely, and it ties back into several of our previous episodes where our guests had looked at the different challenges and problems of regaining the strategic initiative in the South China Sea and INDOPACOM region overall. One of those challenges is how to compete and compete advantageously below the threshold of armed conflict. For a military organization, it's equally challenging to find tools to put into the hands of warfighters that operate below that threshold. Today, we're going to be learning about some of those tools available to Marines. Our guest is Colonel Wendell B. Leimbach, Jr., United States Marine Corps, who is the director of the DoD's Joint Intermediate Force Capabilities Office located on Marine Corps Base Quantico. Colonel Leimbach is a former tank officer, currently serving as a ground marine acquisitions officer. His previous acquisition assignments include service as acquisition team leader for individual body armor and load carriage, program manager for tank systems, deputy director for the Marine Personnel Carrier Program, deputy program manager and acting program manager, Advanced Amphibious Assault. He's going to talk to us today about some of the intermediate force capabilities Marines can consider as that stand-in force operating in an environment of strategic competition. Sir, welcome to the show, and I'll turn it over to you and pull up your slides here.
Great. Thank you very much, Major Brown. I'm very pleased to be here today, and I'd say good day to everybody, ladies and gentlemen. I'm honored to be here as part of the Baruchcast series and to share, honestly, a venue with the late, great Art Corbett. I know that he spoke in this series in the past, and he's a far smarter and more insightful individual than I. But I just wanted to give a little context that I shared the presentation that you're about to see, a virtually identical one with Art about 18 months ago. And he was an early adopter of the intermediate force capabilities concept. And I was humbled to know that he had actually included the IFC concept into some of his writings on before his untimely passing. And so a shout out to Art and all the great things that he did for our Corps, and I'm honored to continue sharing with this audience some more discussion about intermediate force capabilities. Any good brief, I think, has a bit of a story to tell, so I'm gonna do that for you here today. And as the Major outlined, I'd like to provide a little bit of my background as a preamble for this story, and that is the fact that, yes, I grew up as a tank officer, and as such was extremely aware of and focused on lethality in everything I did, preparing to operate as a tanker using combined arms and maneuvering around the battlefield was very much focused on lethality. And then along the way, I became an acquisitions nerd and was given the opportunity to actually procure some of those very lethal things. I was a program manager for tank systems, and then along the way for PM AAA, where we worked on amphibious vehicles that were also focused on mobility, survivability, and lethality. So when I did become the director of now the JIFCO about 2.5 years ago, it was actually known as the Joint Non-Lethal Weapons Directorate. So you can imagine I had a bit of a cultural crisis when I walked in the door as being responsible for non-lethal weapons development. That was certainly not something that I had identified with throughout my career. And as a Marine, I can say that I can tell you that about 95 to 98% of the Marine Corps has no idea that the JIFCO, or the Non-Lethal Weapons Development Program, is part of the Marine Corps, and that the Commandant of the Marine Corps is actually the executive agent for that program for the DoD. And the few people that are aware of that, they had or I believe largely have the perspective that I had when I walked in the door when I heard the term non-lethal weapons. And that was basically cop stuff. And my entire knowledge of non-lethal weapons technology and their utility began and ended with that perspective. So I just share that with you to let you know that I grew up with a lethality mindset, came in the door here at the JIFCO, and had an opportunity to have my mind absolutely opened to an entire different spectrum of capabilities that heretofore I knew nothing about, and to this day, very few Marines and very few people across the DoD fully appreciate. So that's what I'm going to share with you today. So if we go to the next slide, and really, how did we get here? Well, the background of the non-lethal weapons program in the DoD goes back to 1996. When it was established by Congress through the NDAA. And at the time, General Krulak was the Commandant of the Marine Corps, and he volunteered to take on that executive agency. And while that's not intuitive to many these days, with a clear focus in the Marine Corps on lethality, which is a traditional focus we have, back in 1996, it was fresh off of the experiences in Somalia, and we had that experience that was not unique in warfare, in that there was a complex battlefield with combatants and non-combatants interspersed. But what was different was that Somalia was the first war where that all played out in real time. And people watched those events on CNN, and they saw the images, and Congress saw the images of Black Hawk Down and those other situations with significant civilian casualties, and they mandated that the DoD do something about that, and that there be an agency responsible for sponsoring non-lethal weapons technology. Well, General Krulak raised his hand to do that. And if you remember, some of us that were around at that time, General Krulak also was part of the discussion surrounding the three-block war concept. And at that time, there was a lot of talk about having Marines consider situations below the armed conflict and that of solely killing, and the complexity of all those other things that will be going on in and around high-intensity combat in that three-block urban war. So that was really the heyday of non-lethal weapons development within the DoD. But shortly thereafter, what happened was that we came home from Somalia, and a very predictable thing occurred. Because the technology that was available at the time and had been adopted by General Zinni for use in Somalia was largely commercial off-the-shelf policing tools, when that operation ended, the advocacy and responsibility for the continued support of the non-lethal weapons technology was turned over to the MP or force protection communities across the DoD. That was the case in the Army, the Marine Corps, the Air Force, and so while that's absolutely intuitive, because those non-lethal weapon technologies are absolutely core to those MOSs and what they do, the unintended consequence of that was that all the other communities across the services lost insight as to the utility of non-lethal weapons. And all those other communities, the infantry communities, the armor communities, they went back to doing what they'd always done, which is focus on lethality. So when you fast forward a few more years and you look at the terminology of non-lethal weapons and the fact that the Department of Defense right now is extremely focused on enhancing our lethality to be able to compete against near-peer adversaries, you can understand why there was a real challenge when it comes to getting people to pay attention to non-lethal weapons and their utility. So we knew we needed to change the conversation. And we changed the conversation away from just saying non-lethal weapons to a concept known as intermediate force capabilities. And intermediate force capabilities are all those things between presence and lethal intent. And then you step back and you ask yourself, well, how often do we, the DoD, conduct operations on a day-to-day basis around the world where we're not actually intending to kill? That's virtually every day, whether it's humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, training operations, or just being present in other portions of the world. We have a ton of day-to-day experiences where we are interacting with the rest of the world, but the tools that our forces have are largely only lethal tools. So when we find ourselves into challenging situations, often we are at a significant disadvantage. So, could we move on to the next slide, please? This slide is just a quick snapshot of the executive agent guidance that was recently signed by the Commandant of the Marine Corps. It was signed back in March of 2020 that highlighted for us a bunch of very important things. One is the use of the term intermediate force capabilities. That term, while non-doctrinal, is an extremely useful term because it enables us to have a conversation where the term non-lethal weapons did not. Because when you started a conversation and you opened with non-lethal weapons, people immediately assumed they knew everything about it. It was cop stuff, it was rubber bullets, batons, tear gas, and tasers, and that wasn't relevant to their mission set, so they weren't going to talk about it anymore. The intermediate force capabilities, however, is unfamiliar to many people, so it has enabled us to have a very good conversation and to describe that necessity for tools that enable us to conduct our operations between presence and lethal intent. And also this guidance tasked us to reach out to an expanded community set beyond just the MP communities and force protection communities in the services, but to engage those other groups like the infantry, like the armor, artillery, aviation, service combatants, submariners, and get them to appreciate the utility of these tools as we consider how to compete across the competition continuum. And then finally, the guidance changed the name of the Joint Non-Lethal Weapons Directorate to what we have now, which is the JIFCO. Next slide, please. That term, intermediate force capabilities, while still non-doctrinal, has been getting a significant amount of traction. And this slide highlights some places where it actually is either implied or, in fact, specified in key documents. The current NDS talks about being operationally unpredictable and to introduce unpredictability into our capability sets. And it also talks about the ability to strengthen our alliances and with partners and allies. Intermediate force capabilities do all of those things. And the modern technology that I'll be discussing with you later on will highlight how we can absolutely change the paradigm that we currently have and impose significant friction on our adversaries while reducing the risk of escalating into armed conflict. Second here is the National Defense Strategy or Irregular Warfare Annex that highlights the fact that there's a need for irregular warfare capabilities across the force, not just special operations. And there's an implementation plan to that annex that has been recently published, and that implementation plan calls out the need for the integration of intermediate force capabilities in that planning process. And then finally on this slide is the recently signed Tri-Service Maritime Strategy, Advantage at Sea, that was signed in December of 2020. And that document, signed by the Commandant of the Marine Corps, the Commandant of the Coast Guard, and the CNO, absolutely uses the terminology intermediate force capabilities and the fact that they will provide options short of lethal force to contest coercive actions in day-to-day competition. Again, while non-doctrinal, this terminology has proven to be very successful in opening up the door for deeper conversations with several of these important communities. Next slide, please. This slide builds, so go ahead and build that one extra bullet for me. This slide talks to the phases of warfare. And whether you talk about the phases of warfare through phase 0 to phase 5 or a more generic competition continuum between cooperation and armed conflict, in either of these constructs, if you look at the color black as being high-intensity combat and white being peace, you see that the continuum is largely that gray zone. That gray zone is also a non-doctrinal term, but that's a term that is being used more often these days to highlight the need for us to be able to compete in irregular warfare or hybrid operations. And the important thing to understand here is it's not only that we think through this phase 0 to phase 5 operational construct, our adversaries know that this is the way we think. And our adversaries choose to not go to phase 3 because they know that that is where we have invested the vast majority of our resources in not only materiel, but also training and conceptual operations. And that's where we have that advantage of lethality and precision. So what our adversaries are doing right now is choosing to operate at 2.75 on that continuum. And they are winning a long, slow war for free, because we largely do not have tools that enable us to compete in that phase 2 area, and therefore we are ceding that battle space to them. And an analogy of this is that we are creating the greatest NFL football team for phase 3 operations, but our adversaries are playing soccer at 2.75, and they're scoring at will, and we don't even have a team on that field. And so we need to change the way that we engage across the competition continuum, and we need to empower our forces with capabilities beyond just lethality so that we can flip the script on the Chinese, for example, that operate very effectively at 2.75 and are actively winning that day-to-day long, slow war in the Southwest Pacific by using surrogates such as fishing vessels and other agents like their Coast Guard to conduct malign activities that are actually gaining territory. They are actually creating scenarios where they're able to turn coral reefs into islands that are supposedly to support fishing operations, and the next thing you know, there's an airfield on there, and the next thing you know, there's a military base. And they have accomplished this without firing a shot. And they have no intention to actually go to the phase 3 operations. They just know that we are incapable of pushing back at 2.75, and therefore they can win that long, slow war for free. By investing just a little bit in intermediate force capabilities and provide that opportunity for our force to push back, it would absolutely change that paradigm, and it would force our adversaries to stop operating for free and to have to spend some of their limited resources away from trying to catch up to us in our phase 3 dominate capability set and go back and reconsider how they're going to operate at 2.75. Next slide, please. This slide is largely a continuation of the last one, but it talks to the suitability of intermediate force capabilities versus lethal capabilities across that continuum. In this, a green arrow connotates a effective and capability well suited to that phase, yellow not so much, and red not at all. If you look at the competition continuum for intermediate force capabilities, they are appropriate across that entire continuum. Even in phase 3, they have utility, because even in phase 3, we will have the local population that we will have to interact with that we do not want to kill, and there will be critical infrastructure on the battlefield that we do not want to destroy. So that's where intermediate force capabilities are appropriate across that entire continuum, to include high-intensity combat. If you look at lethal capabilities, clearly we need them. Clearly we need to be robust, and they are always necessary for phase 3 operations. However, I would offer that they have limited utility in phase 2 and phase 4, and little to none in phase 0, 1, or 5, other than deterrence. But I would offer to you all that the deterrence of standard lethal effects is no longer relevant when our adversaries are content to operating below phase 3 and win a long, slow war. We need to rethink about how lethality provides deterrence. And I believe that's what our Commandant is doing now with the force design concept. And there is certainly places to look at where intermediate force capabilities could be used as a key enabler to support EABO operations in the future. One last thing about this slide is the disparity in investment. If you consider the overall investment of the DoD in the past few years, and you use a notional defense budget of about $700 billion, and you look at how much of that has been spent towards non-lethal weapons, intermediate force capabilities across the DoD, it is 0.0001% of the budget. And so I am not advocating that we need to spend 10%, 5%, 2%, maybe not even an entire 1% of the budget on intermediate force capabilities. But when we're spending functionally zero on them, and we see their utility across that entire continuum, and the fact that our adversaries are clearly taking advantage of the fact that we don't have capabilities in that portion of the battle space, there needs to be some conversation about where the investment priorities rely in the future. Next slide, please. This slide in this build, hit that button once, please. This top slide talks to the importance of intermediate force capabilities in information space. In information space, these kids throwing a rock at a tank are absolutely kicking that tank's butt. And they're doing that because they know that the tank, while it has a phenomenal amount of lethality, it could not dare win this engagement, because if they win that engagement, they will lose the war in information space. And so our adversaries clearly take advantage of this situation by knowing that the world all has cell phones, and any image that they take could be around the world in a flash. And they would quickly take advantage of this situation to put us at a tactical disadvantage by using children and innocent civilians. And if you click the slide one more time, the investment in intermediate force capabilities truly are a strategic risk mitigation investment that will enable our forces to operate in this scenario and others without losing the war in information space. And as I mentioned, I was an acquisitions guy, or I've been an acquisitions guy longer than I care to admit. But I can tell you, as the former program manager for tank systems, that there is no reason you could not have a green dazzling laser or a bright white dazzler or something like that incorporated into that tank that would enable you to scare those kids away or move them out of the way so that you could continue your operation and not be held hostage in information space. Next slide, please. This slide talks to the necessity of intermediate force capabilities and their ability to provide effects without destruction and still accomplish the mission. It's very important for us to admire the fact that the nature of warfare is changing, and our adversaries are taking full advantage of the fact that we still maintain a binary thinking about lethality. You either use it or you don't. And we are prepared to use overmatching lethality when we need to, but we are not prepared to do anything below that because we aren't preparing our force to operate in that portion of the continuum. So it's very important to understand that we need to have a full .mil PF solution set. It's not just about the technologies I'm going to discuss with you in a moment, but it's about appreciating how and when we train and educate the force to use those technologies. And training and education in the future are absolutely key so that we can empower our forces to operate effectively across this entire continuum without being held hostage in information space and without having those tragic unintended consequences that come when our forces are only provided lethal tools, but then they're provided a scenario that doesn't call for lethal tools. The unfortunate tragedies have played out so many times in Iraq and Afghanistan where our forces are put on the horns of a dilemma and forced to choose between a shoot-no-shoot situation because all they have are machine guns and rifles, and often there's been those tragic circumstances where civilians are injured or killed because it was unknown what that civilian vehicle was moving towards the perimeter or towards a convoy. And there's a significant cost that comes with that. There's a cost to the morale of the units. There's a cost that comes to the readiness of the units and their willingness to continue to engage quickly when that scenario arises again. And then there's a cost to the individual who has to carry the burden of that tragic event with them for the rest of their lives. And our adversaries will absolutely continue to use that dilemma against us to cause us to pause when we shouldn't have to. But if we provided the force with more robust intermediate force capabilities, they would have the tool sets to rapidly react and rapidly engage and neutralize a situation without actually having those tragic circumstances. And then finally, I'll just offer a personal example of when I became a Marine, and when anybody becomes a Marine, they show up at boot camp or OCS and they're handed a rifle and they're told that this weapon is going to solve 99% of their problems. And they should go, and then we train them to think that way and go out to the world and get ready to do that binary shoot, no shoot decision making. But then what happens is the real world happens. and we get called to do missions in a complex world with a complex nature of warfare that is changing and is no longer solely attritionist. We are actually in a competition on a day-to-day basis below armed conflict, but we're training our minds to think only in a binary sense. And as a joint program office, I have an opportunity to work with service members from all the different branches, and to include the Coast Guard. And I will tell you, while I don't advocate that everybody becomes a Coast Guardsman, there are lessons that they offer and ways that they approach problems that are useful for all of us. And the analogy I'll use is the United States Coast Guard will go very lethal very quickly and has that ability. But they don't approach every problem looking for a reason not to shoot somebody. They look for, how do I solve this problem with the least amount of force necessary to accomplish the mission? And if things go sideways, there's somebody in Overwatch with a machine gun ready to go. That's a very helpful way to look at things when you're dealing with a complex battlefield and you're dealing with a complex world where our adversaries are standing by to play a narrative against us because we use too much lethality in a situation that doesn't call for it. So, and a personal example is when I was a lieutenant at Tank Battalion a long time ago, we were assigned to prepare for an in lieu of mission that didn't actually follow through, but we trained for it, and we were going to be called to go guard Haitians, and it was a non-combat mission. And guess who came in and gave us additional training? The United States Coast Guard. The United States Coast Guard was called in to train Marines on how to not kill with the first reaction, because we had all been hardwired back in those days doing line drills that all ended with a foot stomp to the skull. And clearly that was not what was going to be called for. So we had the Coast Guard that actually had to come in and teach us to do less lethal activities. An interesting example from well back in our past. So next slide, please. Now I'm going to share with you some of the technologies that are truly revolutionary. But first, on the left side of this line, this vertical black line, are those legacy systems that most people think of when they hear the term non-lethal weapons. And those are things like rubber bullets, tear gas, stun grenades, 40-millimeter baton rounds, and the like. All of those capabilities have the disadvantage in information space. And those are the capabilities that we readily have available to the force now. Unfortunately, whether you're shooting a marshmallow, a rubber bullet, or buckshot into a crowd, in information space, you're shooting into a crowd, and you're losing that narrative. So that is why even these legacy non-lethal capabilities have significant challenges. The future needs to be directed energy in various forms. We have some examples of that are currently fielded in smaller numbers, things like the handheld green dazzling lasers and also acoustic hailing devices. And while those are the first step, they are underused and under-trained to be used, and I do not believe are incorporated into the planning and operations that our forces need to consider moving forward in this complex world. Additionally, the example of the acoustic hailing devices in the Army, for example, they're fielding thousands of them, but they're going to the MP communities, and they're going to the MISO units and the PSYOP units. They're not being distributed across the service. And that's doubly true in the Marine Corps, who's recently disbanded their MP communities, who were the owners of that capability. And those few acoustic hailing devices in the Marine Corps don't really even have a home now for people to actually train with. So moving forward, though, we need to expand that beyond just handheld devices and simple acoustic hailers. If you look at the right side of that line, I'll highlight the image on the top left, which is a crow's weapon station. Currently, the crow's weapon station is a excellent capability that allows for firing and observing targets on the move, day, night, laser rangefinder, but it only has a 50 caliber machine gun or a Mark 19. There are tens of thousands of those things fielded across the Army on Strykers and in the Marine Corps on JLTVs, some other trucks, and then we'll be also on the Amphibious Combat Vehicle, the ACV. That capability currently only is lethal, but there is no reason that you could not incorporate a green dazzling laser, a bright white dazzler, and an acoustic hailing device as a kit. that could be applied to that crow's weapon station, and then provide any vehicle with a crow's an ability to have an intermediate force capability on short notice. And then when you run into the scenario of the kids throwing rocks at the formation, you're not in that binary choice of do nothing or lethal force. You actually can push back. And you can push back without the tragic unintended consequences of shooting a lethal tool when you didn't want to, and without losing an information space. And to be clear, there's no requirement for this kit. But being an S&T directorate where we are now, we have the luxury of experimenting. And so this is using the Field of Dreams acquisitions process that if you build it, they will come. And so we're building this as a prototype, as a kit, and we're going to share it with the Army and the Marine Corps and any of the other services with hopes that there would be an appreciation that these capabilities would have utility and then somehow become a program of record so that we have that capability set across the force. The other pictures on that side are some other technologies to include occlusion technology, which is the ability to foul propellers without destroying a boat, and then longer range dazzling lasers. But let's go to the next slide, which really has the cutting edge directed energy capability that I would like to highlight. And that is things such as the active denial system. This active denial system is the top three pictures on this slide, is a millimeter wave system. It is a millimeter wave, not microwave, and it is a millimeter wave system that is extremely effective and safe and is silent and visible and has long-range precision. The two prototypes that exist to this day are still large and rather ungainly, but that's because it is technology that has literally been on the shelf for over a decade. And that technology has remained frozen in time, waiting for a service to pick up a requirement and actually take it into full production. This capability the current capability has the ability to engage a person-sized target out to 1,000 meters with great precision and put what is a remarkable heating sensation on them that would absolutely prevent them from doing whatever it is they're doing. And I can tell you from personal experience, I have been gassed multiple times in training. I have been tased, and I never want that to happen again. And I've been engaged by the ADS system. The ADS system is remarkable in that when it is on, you feel the sensation immediately. When it's off, it is over. There is no lingering chemicals on your clothes. There's no long-term discomfort associated with being tased, and it is far safer than any other option that is out there. And as a quick aside, anybody that's been in an airport and stood in the scanner, which takes the image of you and while you have your hands over your head, that is millimeter wave technology. In a scale of 1 to 10, that machine is set up to a 1. The ADS system on a scale of 1 to 10 is about a 3.5 to a 4. And at that level of energy, that's where that heating sensation occurs. And the heating sensation is very similar to what it feels like when you open a very hot oven, and that heating sensation hits you right by the door. Although it hits you and it covers your entire body, and it is something that you cannot tolerate. You have to step away from. But as soon as you do step away from it, the sensation is over. A remarkable capability that has a tremendous amount of utility. If you look at the bottom pictures, the bottom left is a microwave system that we are developing for the United States Coast Guard, and that is a microwave at low power that has the ability to shut down an outboard motor. For the United States Coast Guard, they have interest in that for stopping drug interdictions, but you can imagine how useful a capability like that would be for, say, the United States Navy while they're trafficking through the Straits of Hormuz and being harassed by fast attack boats, and the ability to shut down those motors without having to fire warning shots and begin to lose an information space. The picture in the middle is a similar microwave technology except this is a terrestrial-based version that has the ability to shut down automobile motors. And again, silently and invisibly and at range. And these intermediate force capabilities enable commanders on the tactical level and above to increase their opportunity for decision space and time, and it aids the people on the ground to determine intent at range. The one thing I'll highlight about all these directed energy capabilities, while they've been matured and are something that could actually be procured, they still suffer from a very real phenomenon known as the fear of the new. And this fear of the new is a well-established, real characteristic of the human mind that prevents us from doing something if it's not the perfect solution. And they would rather go with what they know, even though they don't like it. And so, every time we see the images on TV of tear gas going into crowds or people being shot with rubber bullets and losing their eyes, or more tragically being killed if they're hit at close range, we say that's a shame and that should never happen. Yet we keep doing it because we're afraid culturally and unfortunately across the DoD from taking the next step and actually fielding these directed energy systems. And final note on the ADS system, that technology has been demonstrated countless times over the decades and to very senior officers, to include the current commandant and the last commandant, both of which have been engaged by the system. And what happens is, by and large, when most senior people get engaged by the system, they say, that's fantastic, somebody ought to buy that, and then they walk away. And unfortunately, when they say somebody, they don't mean that they are going to be the ones to buy that. So we're actively continuing to try to find requirements that will enable us to get beyond this fear of the new and get that capability into the hands of our warfighters. So next slide, please. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to brief a couple of vignettes that will highlight how intermediate force capabilities have relevance to specifically the Marine Corps and some of our topical areas right now that we're discussing within the Marine Corps. This first vignette is a discussion about how intermediate force capabilities are applicable for stand-in forces and specifically EABO operations. In this scenario, we are talking about a force that is intending to operate inside the WEZ and have to live in and amongst the civilian population while they do that day-to-day mission of deterrence by detection, as the Commandant has said. And so while we're inside that zone, though, even if we're not detected by the adversaries, we will have to interact with that local population on a day-to-day basis. And invariably, there will be friction points. And so if we only have lethal tools out there for our forces, invariably there will be events when they will be pushing our perimeter or interfering with operations in some way, but we don't want to have a unnecessary tragic event. Intermediate force capabilities would enable us to operate and maintain ourselves there at the tactical level without having the undesired aspect of an operational situation if we alienate the population and have to leave. So another example is of where intermediate force capabilities play out here is as our adversaries invariably will identify some of our locations. They will certainly try to use either their own forces or surrogates to try to provoke violent responses to our forces being there. And again, they would do that in information space to try to make our ability to stay there untenable. So we need to have intermediate force capabilities as key enablers at the tactical level that will facilitate the operational presence that we need to conduct stand-in force operations over the long term. And in this case, these are everything from the dazzling lasers to an active denial system and potentially counter-UAS systems that you can engage UAS without actually firing munitions into the sky that would invariably come down somewhere else, but instead use directed energy. So it's a less lethal situation. It's lethal to the UAV, but not lethal to folks downrange. And the operational impact is to enable that littoral force to be able to remain long-term and to preserve their capabilities. And then when invariably they do bump up against the adversaries, because there's going to be those places where they will know each other are present, we have the ability to push back without having to resort to lethal threats and lethal force. But we can make it very complicated and expensive for them to continue their malign behaviors if we're present and pushing back at 2.75 rather than only being ready to fight at phase 3. Next slide, please. This is another example of where EABO stand-in forces and intermediate force capabilities clearly have some synergistic values. In this example, the Marines are conducting a bilateral training with an allied naval force and ground forces in enhancing the concept of EABO, and it's being conducted in an area of the Southwest Pacific that is contentious, and our adversaries just, express displeasure. And so they use that mixed fleet of Coast Guard and/or fishing vessels to try to interdict those operations and make them so that the training event is not viable. Well, if we have the right tools, we can push back in that scenario and not be held hostage by it. Currently, all those forces would have are lethal tools, and they'll have hammers available. But in this situation, that is not an appropriate use for a hammer. We have to provide additional tools to our forces so that they can apply force and push back against that adversarial behavior to enable us to continue our training operations, but not being accused of escalating into a lethal realm. And the other thing to highlight here is that these are capabilities that cannot be just for our forces. These are capabilities that we need to field and share for ourselves and our partners and allies. Our partners and allies need to have these capabilities so that they too can push back in these complicated scenarios against peer or near-peer threats without causing that tactical situation to trip into a unintended strategic crisis. And by giving our allies and partners these capabilities, they too will be able to push back while we're not there, and therefore these intermediate force capabilities also act as an economy of force tool for us, because we cannot be present everywhere all around the world all the time. Next slide, please. This final vignette is specifically about urban operations. We know no matter where we conduct operations, we are likely to be in and amongst that large urban environment, and we are going to have to interact with the local population while we're conducting combat operations. So in high-intensity combat, you know that there's going to be situations that either the adversary is going to use the civilians against you to impose friction, or they're just going to happen to be there while you're conducting a scheme of maneuver. And you're going to need to be able to get through them or around them, but you don't want to do it with an aspect of losing an information space. And that is where intermediate force capabilities would enable us to push back and get the friendly or unknown forces to stop and get away from us while we conduct our operations. And additionally, there will be that critical infrastructure that we don't want to destroy, but we need to do something about. And if we know that an adversary is likely to use a church or a hospital or some other critical infrastructure as a point of advantage to conduct observation and or fire upon us, you could use intermediate force capabilities by means of a dazzling laser and or a active denial system to make it untenable for them to occupy apertures where they would want to try to engage or observe you from in that critical infrastructure. So clearly this is an example of where intermediate force capabilities have utility even in that high intensity combat. Next slide. This is just one additional highlight about that fear of the new that I discussed earlier with regard to the millimeter wave and especially the microwave technologies. This is a problem that we've identified through many, many different scenarios and with many levels of leadership. and we are actively, highlighting this to as many audiences as possible so that we can shine a light on the fact that we as a society need to look at what we deem appropriate and unacceptable with regard to engaging civilians and critical infrastructure. And unfortunately, right now, there is a connotation of directed energy to death rays and cancer-causing, problematic technologies. And certainly, we are all aware of what our potential adversaries may or may not be doing in the media with regard to engaging our forces with some manner of energy, directed energy. We need to get ahead of that. And we need to get ahead of it quickly because we know that the technologies we're developing are safe. We know that we have gone through all the due diligence to make sure that these are far better and far safer options than shooting with tear gas and rubber bullets. Unfortunately, our adversaries may not use that same amount of rigor in the development of their technologies, and we run the risk of having directed energy in general be tainted as being completely unacceptable along the lines of nuclear, biological, chemical weapons. And so we need to educate. We need to make people aware of the safety and the efficacy of these capabilities when properly used so that we can effectively use them ourselves and not be held hostage by others that have used them inappropriately in the past. And the last slide is just a quick summary. I very much appreciate the opportunity to share with you all the necessity of changing the conversation to intermediate force capabilities. The intermediate force capabilities will enable the warfighter to compete across that entire competition continuum without losing in information space and being proactive, not just reactive, as we conduct day-to-day operations at competition below armed conflict. And the ultimate goal is that the IFCs will enable mission accomplishment without that unnecessary destruction and casualties that have marred so many battlefields in the past. So with that, I very much appreciate the opportunity to share those thoughts and look forward to any questions.
Great. Thank you very much, sir. We'll just start going to the chat. So Shane Robinette, if you're able to, you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Hey, sir, thank you for the brief. I'm currently a student at MPS, but I'm heading to second MIG here in about a month. I was just curious if JIFCO has been able to build any relationships with MCIOC or the MIGs to build awareness on these devices and equipment just so that they can be incorporated into future plans, ops, and exercises.
So great question, and I very much appreciate it. Actually, we are making and have made initial inroads with some of the senior folks at DCI and are absolutely interested in sharing as many opportunities of the technology with other venues. So while not directly to MCIOC and the MIGs, we would certainly like to do that in the future. And we are trying to get the message out to as many venues as possible, including this one. But moving forward, if you have an opportunity in one of those environments to reach out to us, we'd very much enjoy the opportunity to come and share the message directly with them.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Great, thanks. That actually covers one of the questions I had here, so that's good. But I do have a couple more, so I just want to throw your way while we still have some time. So first was going through this list of capabilities developed on our side. I was curious if in your S&T and your research and development, if you'd come across any comparable capabilities on competitor sides. Because as I was thinking through your vignettes and some of the other, the news scenarios that we see in recent memory. And it's some of the, competitor things like, a maritime militia going in and basically flooding a place with ships that are painted different colors and people wearing different uniforms. Those seem, pretty sort of blunt instruments compared to the things you've laid out. So I was curious if there's anything in development on an adversary side similar to this, or whether this is a true place where we could gain an asymmetric advantage and something that they don't have.
So we are, through open media, aware that the Chinese and the Russians are aware of these capabilities as well, and that they have in the past advertised research and development efforts to pursue very similar types of capabilities. As far as what is actually fielded and where it may or may not have been deployed, I do not have any specifics on that, but they are aware of what we're doing, and they understand the utility of it. And kind of snatching right out of the headlines is the clandestine nature of directed energy systems that are silent and invisible. The possibility for clandestine use, and then also the plausible deniability that comes with silent and invisible technologies. Our adversaries are certainly well aware of those opportunities.
All right, great, thank you, sir. And then last question I had on my list was you talked about the fear of the new, and that's certainly sort of a state of mind that we're working in any space, as we try and do with our own stuff in the Krulak Center, looking at innovation of future warfare. That attitude is not uncommon, and it's not restrained to any particular place. And as you were sort of talking about that, going back to counter some of those myths of directed energy, these other things, are there any areas where there has been sort of concrete success, either from your office or from similar agencies, in getting these things, adopted or fielded or used, or at least getting the concept accepted, even if it's in a smaller fashion, not across the service, but some, any wins that you've had in this realm?
Well, so I would say with regard to intermediate force capabilities and the specific technologies we're talking about, not directly, but with regard to more lethal tools of directed energy, there are examples of where high energy lasers are being pursued by several services for various means, such as counter UAS and other targets. So there are examples where collectively the services have validated requirements and funded capabilities for high energy lethal directed energy systems. But what is intriguing is that the nuance of a not lethal, an intermediate force capability, sort of seems to be hung up. So we still have that challenge. Now, I can say, though, that some of these prototype systems, while not fully fielded of the intermediate force capability directed energies, while not fully fielded, some of those are being anxiously pursued and by portions of our DoD. They're not out in significant numbers, but there are certain special customers, and the United States Coast Guard, for example, that is extremely interested in having those that directed energy capability for vessel stopping. So it's not for want of the capability. Right now, it's for the want of funding prioritization that is keeping that capability from being fielded sooner. And I truly believe that once we get that first one out, and this sort of goes back to the point of your whole question, once we get that first directed energy intermediate force capability out in the hands of the user, and maybe it will be the Coast Guard for their system, and we all can see how effective and safe and preferable its use is than the current capability, which is shooting out engines with a 50 caliber sniper rifle from the back of a helicopter, then I think the paradigm will shift very quickly. But we are still waiting for that first use for everybody to say, okay, it's been done, now I can get on board. One of the most powerful aspects of the fear of the new is nobody wants to be the first one. And while there's so many people out there historically that have been engaged by the ADS system, we have actually had multiple times where this ADS system was, the prototypes were asked for potential use in operational scenarios. And we would go through all the concept of operations and all the detailed planning, all the way down, in some cases, to actual deployment, only to have them not employed because somebody gets cold feet. And at some point, at some level in the chain of command, somebody says, I don't want to be the first one to use the directed energy system. And once we get past that first one, I think the cat's going to be out of the bag in a good way.
Yeah, no, I again, a lot of what you said there sort of echoes a lot of other attempts to get something new and innovative in there. Is that someone's got to go first, and that's a risk acceptance that is sometimes a hard sell. Got something else in the chat here. Okay,
I can read
got
it. It says, in today's operations, it is highly recommended to combine civil authorities' capabilities into armed forces non-lethal operations, where the military would need those experts for missions like policing, riot control, crowd insurgent, because you cannot draw a clear line between military operations and internal security kind of operations in today's ground ops. One other dimension is law of armed conflict needs to be updated to match today's security environment. That is a great statement and question, and I totally agree with you. I believe it's Isa, and something that we actually were talking about just yesterday with regard to stand-in forces. And if we're going to have an MLR that's going to be able to sustain and maintain themselves in and amongst a local population, we really need to consider what makes up that MLR. And is it only going to be a lethal force, or are there going to be experts in and amongst that force that's living with the local population that have these capabilities, that have the ability to interact and the training to interact with the local population because they know that they can't just deal with everybody with a rifle in their hands. They actually have the training to understand how to interact with in a healthy way, and then have other tools other than weapons in order to deal with those hard points that are invariably going to occur. And then your other statement about the law of armed conflict is absolutely spot on. And we are actively working with different legal minds to try to further an appreciation of how these intermediate force capabilities are relevant in the modern battlefield that currently looks at so many things through the binary prism of lethality and non-lethality. And the law of armed conflict right now really is an extension and a great-great-grandchild of the concepts and the laws of war that were created around World War I, and then modified slightly in World War II to get rid of things like chemical weapons. But since that time, there's been very little, change in the way the Western warfare is conceived of with regard to capabilities between presence and lethality. And we need to actually sit down and have a very robust conversation about how and when intermediate force capabilities can be applied in a complex environment. Because I would offer that you can't continue to look at the use of a system like ADS through the same prism of the level that you would need to engage with a rifle. And along with that, you need to admire the fact that we need to push down the level of authority to actually use that system much lower in the chain of command. Because if we understand truly that an ADS system is much closer to shouting at somebody than it is shooting them with a lethal weapon, we can empower our forces to actually engage in those complex, unknown scenarios without having to get the permission of the battalion commander, for example. You give these capabilities to the forces, you understand that they are safe and effective and will not cause unintended casualties, and then you give the responsibility to the lance corporal or the corporal to actually engage with that kind of capability at their level without being held hostage to an extended escalation of force protocol. I hope that answers some of the question.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great in-depth coverage of that statement, and in fact, that's reminding me of some recent discussions we've had in terms of one, how to sort of model these things and some of the wargame activities that we've offered in our own programs, but also in sort of related to that is that modeling that exact kind of command relationship where what used to be much higher, maybe decisions that have an impact on national strategy, but putting them down at a much lower level because the time to respond is so much shorter and you need to respond in a shorter time. and getting that comfort level. And that probably goes along a little bit with that, not fear of the new is not just the fear of the new technology, but also of putting this technology at a much lower level and trusting that it'll be employed correctly and to the needs of the national strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. And one of the things that we've been actively pursuing is an expanded wargaming and modeling of these capabilities so that we can highlight their actual utility and build a business case as to why the services should invest in intermediate force capabilities in addition to their investments in lethal tools. But I will tell you that it is a challenge to have a war game actually structured to look at competition below armed conflict. Because so many war games and models are designed from the ground up to look at lethality, to look at exchange ratios, and to determine how many missiles are needed to take out how many targets. But what we don't spend much time at is looking at what got us to phase 3. And what is the scenarios that we ought to be looking at prior to phase 3 where we could be using intermediate force capabilities to extend the decision space and time for the leaders prior to phase 3 operations, or better yet, be able to forestall them from going to phase 3 operations entirely. But until we have a more robust modeling and simulation environment that actually admires those problems and provides value to what intermediate force capabilities provide in a way that the resource sponsors can prioritize them, we continue to have this underinvestment in intermediate force capabilities.
Yeah, no, that point about what is and is not is in war games is that echoes some very recent conversations we've had about exactly that problem. Is that game always starts and it goes kinetic right away. We need some more options before it gets there.
And we stand ready to support that. So if anybody on the phone or Major Brown, as you push forward in other forum, please send them our way, because we've been doing some initial work in that area, and not only within the DoD, but also with our partners and allies through NATO working groups. And we have some initial work, but we're absolutely looking for expanded opportunities to get into the United States DoD wargaming venues.
Yeah, and I'll tell you what, sir, later on offline, I've got a couple of people I can think of right away who might be very interested in this to put you in touch with. Okay, so that's the last comment question we had. We're past an hour here, so sir, I just want to before we close out, give you a last chance for any final closing comments or thoughts you want to share with the group here.
No, this has been a fantastic opportunity. Again, I'm humbled to be part of the Broadcast series, and I applaud wholeheartedly what it is that you're doing, and I hope that the intermediate force capabilities concept continues to complement the additional conversations that go on in the future. And thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, and thank you, sir, for your time as well, and connecting with us and getting us in here. Like I said, this is very much in line with a lot of recent episodes we had, so this is a good continuation of that campaign, which, as you mentioned, starting with the late Art Corbett here back in January, we've continued in this vein, and this nests very well with all of that. To our audience, I want to thank you all again for joining today's Broadcast, for looking out here at the summer lineup as we're getting into, as the academic year itself kind of winds down here at MCU. First off, I want to share that we are excited to offer here coming through the summer a new slate of non-resident fellows for the next academic year. And this includes Colonel Sanki Marahans, Senior Research Lead for Strategy and Armed Forces at the German Institute for Defense and Strategic Studies in Hamburg. We have Group Captain Joe Brick, who's the Chief of Staff for the Australian Defense College. And then Captain Walker Mills, United States Marine Corps, who's an infantry officer, but also been a professor at the Columbian Naval Academy for the last couple of years. In that vein, this summer, we want to start re-engaging and plugging our non-resident fellows back into the Broadcast series to get you out in the community of interest and our future students for academic year 22 familiar with those fellows, with their areas of expertise, and what they can offer you in the upcoming academic year. And then as well, for our wider network, we offer them as a resource out there as well. So As we refine that schedule for the summertime, we hope you join us in the coming weeks as we explore all of their great knowledge. So again, thank you for your time and have a good day.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.